Okay, so today we are going to have our second day of poetry. And the thing we want to talk about today is how poets create voices in their poems. And this is something that's really important because we pretty much know when we're watching a play that not everything that every character in the play says is what the author wants to communicate. And we pretty much know that in a short story, if you have a character or a novel, a character who's the villain, that that villain's words don't represent the view of the author. We have a much harder time realizing this when we read a poem because our conditioning with poetry, we expect it to be consistent with the author um, saying something and we attribute that to the author. But the fact is that many poems don't have that perspective at all. In many poems, the author creates a persona or several personas. Some poems have several voices in them. And when the author does this, we have to read against the voice in the poem in order to get to what the author means. And when I say we read against it, that means that we discount what the narrator of the poem is saying. We discount what is clear and most obvious because we realize that the speaker of the poem is not the author of the poem, and the author is trying to give us some other point of view through a character who is not a reliable narrator of the author's intentions. Probably the most important figure in this kind of poetry is Robert Browning. Let's see if we can get a picture of him up there now. Robert Browning, who was a Victorian poet, 19th century poet, one of the two most famous poets in England in the 19th century, with the other one being Alfred Lloyd Tennyson. And they're very different poets. Browning was a very good poet, but he wanted to be a playwright. And he started out writing plays, and they were just awful. And you can't even find them anymore because they weren't very good plays. But what he did is he took the playwright's point of view, and he created poetry that was in the form of what are called soliloquies. And a soliloquy is the portion of a play where the character comes out and talks to the audience alone. Probably the most famous soliloquy in history is Hamlet's "To be or not to be, that is the question." That's Hamlet talking to the audience. When a soliloquy is put in a standalone poem, the word for that is a dramatic monologue. A dramatic monologue is a poem that is conceived of as a speech within a play, or as a short little one-act tiny play in and of itself. And that's what most of Robert Browning's poems are. My Last Duchess is a very famous poem of his. Andrea del Sartre, Fra Lippo Lippi. These are all very well-known poems, some of them very long, some of them many pages long, in which a single character who is not the same voice as the author addresses us as an audience. The Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister is one of his easiest poems to understand, actually, and it's not even a particularly easy poem to understand, but it gives us a pretty clear sample of the way that Browning wrote poetry and the way that he conceived of poetry. And what I want to do is go through this poem, and I'm going to do my fairly bad attempt at a dramatic reading, and then pause at the end of every stanza and talk about what we learn from each stanza. So let's start with Robert Browning, The Soliloquy of a Spanish Cloister. And if you don't know what any of those words mean, you always need to look them up. And this, by the way, is one of the most important things I can tell you about poetry, is look up any word you don't know, because it's probably very important. And if you see a word that you don't understand, figure out what it means. Don't just read over it. The two words here that are probably going to trip a lot of people up, one is soliloquy. And as I've already said, a soliloquy is a speech that somebody gives out on stage alone, if they're an actor. So a soliloquy is a solo speech in a play. And a cloister means a monk or a nun. To be cloistered is to be shut up in a monastery or a convent. So the Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister is a speech by somebody who is a monk in a Spanish convent, um, probably in the Middle Ages. I can tell you that just from what I know about the poem. And he's going to tell us some things, and we're going to try to figure out what they mean. So he starts with a very animalistic expression. He says, "Grrr! There you go, my heart's abhorrence. What do your damned flower pots do? If hate killed men, Brother Lawrence, God's blood would not mine kill you. What? Your myrtle bush wants trimming? Oh, that rose has prior claims. Needs its leaden vase filled brimming? Hell dry you up with its flames." So what did we learn from this? First of all, we learned that the Spanish cloister is not a very nice guy, and he's not a very spiritual guy. As a matter of fact, he starts off with just an animal grunt. Grrr! There you go, my heart's abhorrence. He has an enemy. His enemy is named Brother Lawrence. And Brother Lawrence is another monk in the cloister. That's the only person he could be, because that's the only people that they see in the cloister. And he wants to kill Brother Lawrence. He hates Brother Lawrence. And he actually mocks Brother Lawrence in here. And we get a few things about Brother Lawrence that come out here. Because starting with the fifth line, those are kind of in the voice, the mocking voice of Brother Lawrence. What? Your myrtle bush wants trimming? Oh, that rose has prior claims. Needs its leaden vase filled brimming? Hell dry you up with its flames. So what we know about Brother Lawrence is that he likes to trim bushes. He likes to trim rose bushes. He likes to work in the garden. And the speaker sees him as, for some reason, detestable. So our job is to figure out why the speaker sees Brother Lawrence in such a detestable light. The next verse gives us some clues. At the meal we sit together. Salve tibi, I must hear. Wise talk of the kind of weather, sort of season, time of year. Now these italicized lines are direct quotes from Brother Lawrence. Not a plenteous court crop, scarcely dare we hope oat galls. I doubt. What's the Latin name for parsley? What's the Greek name for swine snout? So what's going on here? We get some clue into who Brother Lawrence is. He seems to be fairly simple. He seems to be very friendly. He seems to talk about the weather. Seems to talk about things that are going on. He seems to be pleasant, simple-minded, friendly, and for some reason, the narrator, who's probably been stuck up with him for like 20 years, just can't stand him. So we move on to the next. Phew, we'll have our platter burnished, laid with care on our own shelf. With a fire new spoon we're furnished, and a goblet for ourself. Rinsed in something sacrificial ere 'tis fit to touch our chaps. Marked with L for our initial. There his lily snaps. Now, he's using the we here, and this is important. He's using the we here in a mocking fashion, the way that you would mock somebody who's always talking about themselves in very simplistic ways. So he says, phew, we'll have our platter burnished. So he's saying, that's what Brother Lawrence is saying. Well, we'll have our platter. You know how you would say that to a children? Well, we'll just have our food right now. So he's infantilizing Brother Lawrence here, talking about how he talks about his silverware, a goblet for ourselves, raised like something sacrificial. He's mocking his piety here. And at the very end, he says, ha ha, there his lily snaps. And again, this is a crucial moment in the poem because it's giving us another clue into the narrator's hatred of Brother Lawrence. Because the fact that the poem, there's always a sex part of the poem. Saint, forsooth. And that saint is like, everybody calls him a saint. Clearly, everybody else thinks highly of Brother Lawrence. Saint? Ha! Forsooth, while brown Dolores squats outside the convent bank with Sanchicha telling stories, sleeping tresses in the tank, blue-black, lustrous, thick like horsehairs, can't I see his dead eye glow? Bride as 'twere a Barbary corsair's, that is, if he'd let it show. So there are women outside of the convent, and he is accusing Brother Lawrence of looking at them with a lustful eye that nobody can see. But he is. It's there if he'd let it show. Well, again, what's going on? Clearly, the narrator is the one who's looking at these women with lustful eyes. He is giving no actual evidence that Brother Lawrence is doing the same. He's telling us a lot more about himself than he is about Brother Lawrence. And this is a key to reading the poem. This is not a poem about Brother Lawrence. This is the poem about a psychotically angry monk who is obsessively jealous and obsessively hateful of somebody else. Again, because why wouldn't you be if you're locked up with somebody for 20 years? This is kind of the thing that happens, which is kind of Browning's critique of the monastic life. So now we're going to do, let me do two stanzas at once that are both his imagined threats against Brother Lawrence. He says, when he finishes refection, which means eating, knife and fork he never lays crosswise to my recollection, as I do in Jesus' praise. I the Trinity illustrate, drinking watered orange pulp in 3 sips, the Arian frustrate, while he drains his at one gulp. Oh, those melons, if he's able, we're to have a feast so nice. One goes to the abbot's table, all of us each get a slice. How go on your flowers, non-double? Not one fruit sort can you spy? Strange, and I too, at such trouble, keep them close-nipped on the sly. Okay, let's break this down. These are important. Every paragraph, every stanza in a poem like this is extremely important. First, he's criticizing him for heresy. He is, and this is made up out of whole cloth. He is saying, Brother Lawrence is a heretic. And here's how I can prove it. Whenever I finish my meal, I put my knife and my fork in a cross, and he just puts his down. I talk about Jesus that way. Also, the Arians, if you don't know anything about the Arian heresy, it was an early Christian heresy that denied the Trinity. So he's saying, when I drink my watered orange pulp, I drink it in 3 sips to frustrate the Arian or to illustrate the Trinity. He just drinks his. Well, these are ridiculous things. I mean, these are not signs of actual piety. These are signs of a sort of obsessive compulsion to seem pious. So he's taking a monk who's, by everything we can tell, just a decent, simple, genuinely pious fellow, and he's accusing him of heresy in his mind for not performing these rituals, which are by no means required by monastic life, but are rituals that he finds personally important. And then he talks about Brother Lawrence's melons. So clearly Brother Lawrence is the gardener, and he wants to serve melons to all of his fellow monks because he likes them and he's a good person. But we see that the narrator has been going out at night and snipping the buds off of his melons so that they never grow, again, out of his sort of hatred and reaction. And then we get what he's going to do. He wants to punish Brother Lawrence by sending him to hell, because that's, given his culture, that's what he can think of as the greatest way to punish his hated enemy. There's a great text in Galatians. Once you trip on it entails 29 distinct damnations, one sure if another fails. So he's looking through the Bible, trying to find a way to make him say or do something that's against the Bible. So he's looking at Galatians 5:15 through 23, which is just a whole bunch of possible offenses against God. If I trip him just a dying, sure as heaven as he can be, spin him round and send him flying off to hell, a Manichee. So he's going to try to get him to commit some minor sin right as he's dying so that he can't get his last rites and then he'll die in a state of sin. That's his plan. Again, it's crazy, it's psychotic, and that's the point. We're looking at somebody who has just become driven blind with irrational hatred. Or, he says, my scrofulous, that means dirty, French novel on gray paper with blunt type. Simply glance at it, you grovel hand and foot in Belial's gripe. If I double down its pages at the woeful 16th print, when he gathers his green gauges, ope a sleeve and slip it in. So he's going to slip in a pornographic novel. Notice whose pornographic novel it is. It is the speaker's pornographic novel that he's going to put down at the worst page and slip it in so Brother Lawrence will commit the sin of reading what the narrator has clearly already read. Then we get almost complete dissolution in the last stanza, which is where he wants to sell his soul to Satan in order to punish Brother Lawrence, except make some bargain that he can get out of. Or there's Satan, one might venture, pledge one's soul to him, yet leave. Such a flaw in the indenture, as he'd miss till past retrieve. Blasted lay that rose acacia we're so proud of, high sein hein. There's Vespers, plena gratia, Ave Virgo, you swine. And he just descends into this guttural animal hatred. So what we see here, we have a poem. If you try to read this poem without realizing you're getting a psychological portrait of a very disturbed narrator, you're not going to be able to make any sense out of the poem. So to read a poem like this, you've got to first of all figure out who's speaking, who are they speaking about, what are they saying, and what does the poet want us to see? The poet does not want us to see that Brother Lawrence is an evil person who must be destroyed. The poet wants us to see that this narrator has become so blinded with hate and resentment that he's falling into just delusional fantasies of revenge and aggression, and that's something that can happen to us when we let hate consume us and take us over. Okay, now let's turn to our next poem, which is on page 520. And this is an untitled poem by E.E. Cummings. And you may have seen E.E. Cummings before. He was a modernist poet in the 1920s, a World War I veteran, and a very serious writer, but he wrote in a very playful way. He didn't capitalize his name and lots of other things. He ran words together. He made up new words. He broke words in funny places. But what he's really focusing on a lot of very critical issues, and most of them have to do with his experiences in World War I. He wrote a pretty famous novel called The Enormous Room, which was his experience as a prisoner of war in World War I. And he was, as a result of that experience, a very anti-war poet and one who cared deeply about peace, decency, kindness, and a strong opposition to the kinds of feelings that get people into wars. And that is what this poem is about. But let's kind of look at what we've got here and who is speaking. You notice that it begins with quotation marks, and everything except the very last line is a quotation from somebody else. The last line, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. That's what we get from Cummings or from the narrator. Everything else we're supposed to read against. We're supposed to see this as what somebody else thinks that the poet does not think. So whoever this person is says, and also notice this poem is a perfect sonnet. It rhymes, it has a lot of meter, it has a lot of funny words, but it's actually a very structured poem. Next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early, my country, 'tis of centuries come and go, are no more what of it, and we should worry in every language. Even deaf and dumb thy sons acclaim your glorious name by gory, by jingo, by gee, by gosh, by gum. So what you should notice here is that whoever is speaking a lot of very patriotic words, but doing it almost in a word salad. There's not a lot of coherence here. A lot of popular patriotic songs, America, I love you, land of pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early, my country 'tis of thee. He's just running together patriotic phrases that don't mean anything. And this is really exactly what Cummings' critique of this kind of attitude was, that we got ourselves into World War I because people were jingoistic and patriotic and loved America and used that in an unthinking way to push a whole lot of people into a war that we didn't need to be in, that caused him and a lot of other people great misery. So the key here is this speaker is an unthinking patriot, somebody who reflexively says the patriotic words, but doesn't put them in any coherent order. But because of people like this, Cummings is saying, we end up going to war. Why talk of beauty? What could be more beautiful than these heroic, happy dead who rush like lions to the roaring slaughter? They did not stop to think, they died instead. Then shall the voice of liberty be mute. And this is really the payoff part of the sonnet, the payoff part of the poem. First, we have all of these non-thinking allusions to America, loving America, this reflexive patriotism. And then, in the second half of the poem, we get this drumbeat for war. Who could be more beautiful than these heroic, happy dead? Which Cummings thinks is ridiculous, and so should you, that the people who die in the name of glory are going to have happy, wonderful deaths, and what a great thing is that they can die for their country. This is actually a kind of an allusion to the old Roman phrase, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, or how sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country, which was something that was said a lot during World War II. So Cummings is showing how this unthinking patriotism leads to unfeeling advocacy of warfare, almost for its own sake, and to make the people who are dying in war seem happy to do it and not really consider them as individuals or human beings. So that's the speech that is the dramatic monologue. Then we get at the very end, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. And that's the line that just should devastate you by seeing that this person, first of all, is in a safe place. You know, he's talking and doesn't really have any idea of what war is. He's got a glass of a very ordinary thing. So it's both the ordinariness of drinking a glass of water quickly, the sort of thoughtlessness of these are just things to say while taking a glass of water, and also the casualness of this last line, as opposed to the drumbeat for war we get before us, is giving us a great contrast between how the poet sees the world and how the speaker of the dramatic monologue sees the world. Okay, you've got one other poem which we're not going to discuss, which I'm going to ask you in your bulletin board post for today to read the poem by X.J. Kennedy in a prominent bar in Syracuse one day, and answer 3 questions. Who is speaking? Who is the voice of this poem, or the voices of this poem? Who are they speaking to, and what are these voices saying? And I'd like you to do that for a couple of paragraphs as your major bulletin board post for today. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.